on June 23rd, 1950. Were you around then? You were. A commercial airliner of 58 passengers aboard on its way from LaGuardia to Seattle was thought to have crashed into Lake Michigan. No wreckage was ever found at that time, however. After a half a century later, a team from the Michigan Shipwreck Research Association, led by our guest speaker, Valerie van Heest, attempted to locate the lost aircraft and solve the mystery of its disappearance. The efforts of this group revealed that answers are sometimes found in unexpected places. So our guest today, Valerie van Heest, is an award-winning author and underwater explorer who holds a BA from Loyola University. That's in Chicago. She is a co-founder and director of the Michigan Shipwreck Research Association. In her book, which came out in 2013, Fatal Crossing, the Mysterious Disappearance of Northwest Airlines Flight 2501, chronicles this disaster and subsequent recovery efforts. So I'm going to ask you to please help me welcome Valerie van Heest.
Thank you, Kit. My book came out in 2013. That was a while ago. Is it still relevant after all those years? I've been talking about it since 2004. And actually, the books that are now in the stores and on Amazon are updated. There have been many versions, and I'm so pleased that my editor, Ann Weller, is here. So she knows this. She's just going to check and make sure I remember the facts correctly. No. I see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces. How many of you might have already read this book? Okay, a few. So a handful. So the program will put some faces to what you've read. For those who haven't read it, let me just share that a lot of times when I do this program I call it the CAN version. That is, you got some music and lots of video, and I stick to a script. But today we're gonna go off script. We're just gonna talk. I'm gonna share the project with you, and then I'm gonna give you an update. And you are the only people that are gonna see some special artifacts that you could only see in a museum, but they're here today. So consider it a special day. Let's go back to 1950, 85 years ago, and see what happened to cause, sorry. I've been talking about it a long time. Yeah, 75. So this past June was the 75th. But let me tell you why I said 85, because I've also last week been talking about the Armistice Day storm of 1940, which also happened in Lake Michigan. And so that's where the 85 came from. It's been a busy month. Back in time. We're going to kick up the sound.
23rd, 1950. Northwest Airlines Flight 2501. A Douglas DC-4 airliner with 4 propeller engines took off from New York's LaGuardia Airport at 7:30 p.m. and headed west under clear skies on its way to Seattle, Washington, with a scheduled stopover in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The pilot was Captain Robert C. Lynn. In the right-hand seat was co-pilot Vern F. Wolf. Stewardess Bonnie Ann Feldman was in the passenger compartment, taking care of 55 passengers, identified as 27 women, 22 men, and 6 children. As the DC-4 passed over Battle Creek, Michigan, it entered a storm front at 11:51 p.m. Eastern Time. Captain Lynn radioed the Air Traffic Control Center at Chicago that he estimated they would pass over Milwaukee at 11:37 p.m. Central Time. He was flying level at 3,500 feet. As the plane reached the Lake Michigan lakeshore and the full force of the storm, Captain Lynn requested clearance from air traffic control to descend to 2,500 feet.
Chicago, like 1501, requesting clearance to 500. Flight 2501, this is Chicago. Request denied due to other traffic in the area. Roger, Chicago, this is flight 2501, received your denial and continuing at 3500.
That was the last communication from Flight 2501. By dawn's light, it became clear that 2501 had crashed. Debris from the plane floated endlessly over the surface of the lake. The airplane, along with 58 men, women, and children, had disappeared, leaving no clues as to what had occurred. The loss of Northwest Airlines Flight 2501 represented the worst commercial aviation disaster at that time.
So if any of you were around when that happened, you were babies. So you weren't reading the headlines. But can you imagine in the papers today, this headline, 58 people die in the lake? That just doesn't happen in Lake Michigan, but it did. And at the time, this was the country's worst aviation disaster. And of course, there have been worse since, but at the time, this was tremendous loss. And all Coast Guard and Navy vessels, 5 of them were called to the area off West Michigan to try to search for survivors. But in short order, they realized there were no survivors. This is one of the Coast Guard vessels that was used in that operation. It was initially a commercial fisherman, Julius Allers, operating out of South Haven, who went out on Sunday morning. This accident happened on a Saturday evening. And on Sunday morning, he went out to retrieve his commercial fishing nets. And in those nets, he pulled up things that did not appear to be fish, pieces of flesh. And then as he retrieved that net, he also found inside a suitcase with a shirt and a tie. And that shirt was years later, as I started researching this accident, that shirt was given to me by Julius Allers' daughter, who had kept it all those years. And before we go any further, this is one of these special things. This is the shirt that was recovered from Lake Michigan. There's holes in it. It's a beautiful men's shirt with a high-end label in it and a couple of ties. And interestingly, Julius Allers' daughter, when she received this, it had a note from her father to her mother saying, "Dad recovered these items from that airplane crash. The shirt didn't fit him, but he wore the ties for many years." So this shirt has been on a couple different television episodes because it's such an amazing artifact to have. But back in the day, Julius Allers returned to South Haven. By then, he had read those headlines and he realized that those weren't fish in his net, those were pieces of human flesh. And he came into the Coast Guard station, told them what he had found, and within just hours, those Coast Guard and naval vessels were redirected to the waters off South Haven. And where Julius Allers directed them, they found a field of debris, and blanket stamped Northwest revealed that this debris was from that airplane crash. And the hunt then became one of recovery, not saving anybody from the water. And there were helicopters involved. They were working mostly out of St. Joe Benton Harbor. That was a bigger port than South Haven at the time. So as the week went on and more debris and human remains were recovered, the newspapers reported that. It was big news every day for about a week. And it took our team quite a bit of effort to find this next piece of film. In fact, it took us years from learning about this accident, but take a look at the newsreel from 1950 in June.
Rescue craft and plane search the waters of Lake Michigan near South Haven, Michigan, for clues to the worst airline disaster in U.S. history.
I don't know why the sound's not behaving.
The death of all 58 people.
Well, I think they were gonna keep an eye out. Yeah.
Miles offshore in Lake Michigan on a route flight from New York to Minneapolis.
It's repeating the details of the flight, but you see what's most evocative is you see these images. Do we want to play that again or? Okay, yeah, let's play that again. I put it to the. Okay. Okay, we're gonna do it again and see.
Rescue craft and planes search the waters of Lake Michigan near South Haven, Michigan, for clues to the worst airline disaster in U.S. history. Pieces of passengers' clothing and other debris tell a tragic story. The death of all 58 people aboard a Northwest airliner. It crashed a few miles offshore in Lake Michigan on a routine flight from New York to Minneapolis. The cause of the catastrophe, unknown.
So a lot of debris was picked up, a lot of human remains were picked up. Human remains were brought into the Coast Guard station at St. Joe. But anything that the Coast Guard and the Navy did not pick up offshore washed ashore onto the beaches of South Haven. This was the week of June 25th, 1950, and South Haven, as it is today, was a small tourist community, and there were 10,000 people due in South Haven for the 4th of July holiday. That normally kicks off the tourist season there. It still does today. And the mayor was forced to close the public beaches because of the horrific things that were washing ashore. Well, the Navy and the Coast Guard continued to recover human remains and debris from the lake. And then after 1 week, they declared that this was done. They'd recovered everything they could. They were unable to find a site of this crash. They did have some rudimentary bottom finding equipment there, and they were never able to figure out where this accident occurred. Well, when we think back in time to June 1950, what else was going on? Within just a few weeks of that accident, newspaper headlines changed dramatically, and we were now going to be embroiled in another war, which back then nobody wanted to hear just 5 years after the end of World War II. So the what we know now as the Korean War began, and thoughts of this accident faded pretty quickly. It took the government 6 months after this accident to come out with its CAB report, the Civil Aeronautics Board report. That organization was the precursor to the NTSB that investigates accidents today. And interestingly, despite this being the worst aviation disaster in the country, this accident report was 4 pages long, and it concluded with, there's not enough evidence to make a determination of the cause of this accident. So from there, it became quite the mystery. This was a DC-4 plane that crashed, and in very short order, propeller planes were replaced by jets. And very quickly, in about the 70s, this accident was attributed to the Great Lakes Triangle. So this was blamed on, a mysterious occurrence. And interestingly, when I was being introduced, whatever notes were presented said no debris was ever found. Well, that came from the author of this book, who said this just disappeared into thin air. No debris was found. It must have been a UFO. And so there was so much misinformation from the publication of that book on, and that book also spurred the idea of the Michigan Triangle, which I could do a whole program about, because there's absolutely no alien activity on Lake Michigan or the Bermuda Triangle. We live near a dangerous body of water. So now, how did I come about doing all this? Let me share a little bit of background. Several of you know my background. I started diving when I was a teenager, so I've been at it for about a decade now. You know, just a short amount of time. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. My career was in interior architectural design. I spent a number of years doing that in Chicago. And in Chicago, having been a scuba diver since my teens, I ended up getting involved with the Chicago Maritime Museum. And we formed an organization specifically focused on the maritime history, the submerged maritime history off the shores of Chicago, formed a nonprofit, the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago. And we had a team of people dedicated to documenting the many shipwrecks off the shores of Chicago. Now, my architecture skills came into play there because my job was to lead surveys and then end up generating site plans to show the various different shipwrecks. And so I became very familiar with maritime history, how ships were constructed, the reasons that these many ships went down. And back in the day when I was with the Chicago Maritime Museum as a volunteer, I used my design skills to create an exhibit for that museum. And now, all these years later, more than a decade, I hate to say, I am now a museum exhibit designer in addition to being an author. But along the way, I took a project. I led a team in Lake Huron, and we were documenting a shipwreck over there. And I met this man and ended up marrying him and coming to Holland, hence my last name changed from Olson to Van Heest. And Jack and I co-founded the Michigan Shipwreck Research Association, which is a board of individuals, all divers. And we made it our goal here to research shipwrecks, to get out on the water, to search for them when we find them, to document them, to write articles, books, create public presentations. And since we began in 2000, we have been hosting annual events. Somebody just asked me about it. We have an annual event at the Knickerbocker every year, and that raises money to do what we do. That's our single source of fundraising. So if anybody wants to mark their calendars, the event this year will be March 27. And we usually bring multiple speakers in and have an evening of exploring the Great Lakes. But that kind of tells you how I got involved in all this. 2001, our team made our first discovery. We search using a device called side scan sonar, and it gives us an image like this. And I don't think any of you have to be experts in interpreting side scan to see that that's a ship. And it looks like there's an anchor chain out there. And indeed, we did find a ship. We were looking for the Chicora, a ship lost in 1895. And instead, when we got the dive team down there at 275 feet deep, we discovered this ship did not look like the Chicora, but it did look like a ship called the H.C. Akeley. And so we learned that the Akeley was struggling in a storm off Holland in 1883, and it went down just off the shores, about 18 miles off our shores. And it was a major new discovery. There hadn't been a lot of big steamships ever found off the shores of Holland. And so our state archaeologist at the time, John Halsey, asked me to write an article for Michigan History Magazine. And I said, but John, I haven't done any writing. And he said, don't worry, you can. And I wrote an article. I guess, you know, he encouraged me to do that. And it was it was very exciting for me to have that article, my first published article, and that got the word out about our organization. And we set our sights on finding we kept looking for the Chicora, and one of our members, Craig Rich, some of you might know Craig, he did his own article. It was published in the South Haven Tribune, and he had learned about the loss of Northwest Flight 2501. And he penned this article. They printed it word for word in the paper. And interestingly, he was just writing an article about what happened, but the editor took a little license and wrote, "Dive group hopes to find remnants." Well, we had no plans to go looking for this airplane. We had searched for 4 years before we made our first discovery. The Akeley was a 200-foot long steamship, and we knew that this DC-4 was 100 feet long, and we expected that when it hit the water, it broke up into lots of little pieces based on the debris that was being found on the lake surface. So we had no intention to go looking, but there was this article, and that article came out in 2003. And in 2004, Craig received a phone call from this man. Does anybody recognize him? Clive Cussler, famous author. Remember, at this point, I had written one article, but our group was getting a call from Clive Cussler. So for those of you who know him, he'd written about 40 books, all about the dreamy-eyed diver Dirk Pitt who saved the world by somehow going underwater and doing some great feat. But for us divers, beside his fictional books, we knew about his 2 nonfiction books, where he wrote stories about how he took his royalties from writing all these great fictional books, and he funneled his royalties into searching for some of the world's most famous lost vessels, ships, but also he looked for a railroad and a locomotive that went off a bridge. And his most famous search and discovery was the Horace L. Hunley, the first submarine to sink an enemy warship in battle off South Carolina. And his team, headed by Ralph Wilbanks, an archaeologist from South Carolina, in fact discovered the Hunley. And in short order, a nonprofit was put together. The Hunley was raised. It was brought into a museum setting. It was conserved. And I have met personally with the team of conservators, and all 7 humans that were operating this, their flesh and bones and skeletons were found inside of this. So if you ever get a chance to read about the discovery of the Hunley, one of the crew members, Charles Dixon, always carried a coin in his pocket that was engraved by his wife, and the coin was found in his pocket in the submarine. That's a whole other story, but this was the caliber of people that Clive Cussler was willing to send to Holland to work with us. And indeed, in short order, we formed a dual joint venture project team with NUMA, the National Underwater Marine Agency, and our little Michigan Shipwreck Research Association. We had 1 discovery under our belts, and they had probably 100 discoveries under their belt. So what we did is we split up the work, and our team began researching this accident to try to pinpoint the location of the accident. And part of our research led us to understand that while all DC-4s look alike, all ships do not look alike, but all airplanes of a certain type look alike. And this particular plane was a C-54 built in during World War II. It rolled off the production line at Orchard Field, which is in Illinois. And if anybody recognizes Orchard Field, that is today the site of one of the world's busiest airports, O'Hare. So if you ever wonder why the call letters for Chicago O'Hare is ORD, it's because it was Orchard Field. And this particular plane we encountered during our research, we encountered an aviation photographer, Leo Kuhn. And when he learned that we were searching for this, he looked through his archives. He found this photograph. I've colorized it, but it's the only photograph when it's painted in its Northwest Airlines livery. It originally was built for the government as a C-54. It came out of the war. It was converted to a DC-4, which is the passenger version of a C-54. But the only thing that tells us this was originally a C-54 is the double aft cargo door. So when it was purchased by Northwest, they outfitted it for 55 passenger seats, and it could operate with a crew of 3, a stewardess, and they called them stewardesses back then, and a pilot and a co-pilot. So as we continued to research both the plane and the accident, we got our hands on the Jeppesen charts, which are the charts that aviators used when they were flying. And I've been able to stitch those charts together to understand how pilots flew and understand how the charts guided them. And I don't know, let me see if this pointer, yeah, pointer works. So I'm going to point to the right over here. We know that the flight originated in New York. Back then, there were airways in the sky. There were 4 colors. Green and red were the colors that operated east-west. So our flight was scheduled on this green airway to the Willow Run airway, which then it would get on Air Corridor Red 57. It would continue on, and over each major city that you see with these white dots, the pilot would check in with the ground control that would be operated right below him. Back in the day, they navigated with beep tones in their headsets so they could know they were staying on the right path if the beep tones were, sending out the correct signals. So that's how they navigated back in the day. So over every major city, they would announce their arrival over that city. They're not touching down. They're just saying, I'm flying over that city. But we also know from information that the pilots, when they left New York at 8:30 p.m. on a Friday night, June 23, excuse me, they were given a weather chart that indicated that a squall line was forming. Now, we don't have to be meteorologists to see the squall line here, this big mass that tells us the squall was a northwest squall, and it was moving directly east right over Lake Michigan. So the pilot was given that warning, and he started at 6,000 feet. He was told to reduce over Ohio, to reduce his altitude to 4,500. When he got to the Willow Run area, he was told to reduce his flying height to 3,500 to try to fly under this squall line. And we know that when he reached the shores of Lake Michigan, he was over the town of Glen. You all know where Glen is, south of Saugatuck. And at that point, we don't know a lot that was going on. We do know that when he reached the lakeshore, he asked for clearance to reduce to 2,500 feet. And that clearance was denied because there was a plane getting ready to take off in Milwaukee and fly that same air corridor. And so he was told no reducing the height because of other traffic in the area. And that was really the last communication from that flight. Well, Clive Cussler sent his sonar operator, Ralph Wilbanks, to work with us. And as I said, Ralph was the man responsible for finding the Hunley. So it was really an honor to have Ralph join us. Here's our boat getting ready in our humble driveway in Holland. And we're going to take it down to South Haven to begin the search, because that was our best estimate based on the Civil Aeronautics Board report, which indicated that they thought the possible crash site was 18 miles northwest of Benton Harbor. The reason they use Benton Harbor is because those Coast Guard and Navy boats were operating out of that city, but that particular direction put us straight off of South Haven. So here's the team, just to give you a little idea of what it takes to search. This is the boat. We're using side scan sonar. It has to be deployed into the water. It has to ride about 30 feet above the surface. It sends out acoustical signals. You see a shot weight being put on the line. This is about $100,000 piece of equipment. It looks like a little mini torpedo. There's Ralph, who owns this equipment, you know, always very dicey to be lowering $100,000 worth of equipment into the water with just that small cable. But what is critical to searching is getting it the right height off the water, making sure that you've got your search area plan, which is typically a rectangular grid. And then critical is also keeping track of where you are when you're going to search. You plan the area you're going to search, and you drive the boat back and forth like mowing the lawn, and it sends out acoustical signals. And if anything's found, an image will print out on a monitor on the boat. You'll see a lot of side scan images. Well, that first year, there we are about 18 miles off South Haven, and we covered about 5 square miles. The team insisted on coming in the fall, even though we said spring is the best time of searching when the water is still cold, but we don't have as many storms as we have in the fall. So we were very happy to hear that this was not just a one shot and done, that Clive Cussler was committing to sending the team back the next year. So we spent the winter of 2004, 2005 going through a lot of archives, looking for more information. And one of the critical things that we found was the Coast Guard and the Navy logbooks from all of the efforts over that 5-day period that they were picking up debris and looking for some kind of hit on the bottom. And every piece of debris that they brought up had a latitude, longitude associated with it. And today we have GPS, which uses latitude, longitude. So we were able to pinpoint all the places where they picked up debris. And this is a kind of a generic map, but the epicenter this is South Haven, right here. And so this is everything that the Coast Guard was finding, but the dots along shore are where we had reports of debris and human remains washing ashore. One of the other things we found were those Jepson charts that I talked about, and we got a more detailed one of Lake Michigan. And so we could see that the red 57 was the airway that the flight was scheduled to fly on, but we also knew that the last radio call, the one where he was denied going down to 2,500 feet, was closer to Benton Harbor, which happens to be at the east end of airway red 28. There was no talk that he had changed airways, but it was interesting that he was near red 28 when he radioed. And we know that because he said, I'm in the vicinity of Benton Harbor. But all the debris that was found floating offshore was found between those two airways. Now, back in the day, a pilot flying outside of an airway would be a very dangerous thing to do. We stay on the highways when we drive. We don't drive through the cornfield. So we were fairly certain that the pilot had stayed in one of those two airways. And our team was really pretty convinced that the pilot had taken it upon himself to change airways, and he could do that. They were allowed to change as much as 25 miles, and those two airways are separated by just a little under 25 square miles. But we turned to the Great Lakes Environmental Research Center. We had worked with a scientist there developing a search area for the Chicora, and that scientist did a process called hindcasting, where he looked at all the debris that came ashore. He plotted the areas where the debris was found offshore, And he created a scenario where he could define approximately where the plane crashed to have brought the debris to shore where it did. And unfortunately, back in the day, this was 2005 that we were working with him, his programming only allowed him to narrow down the search area to a 600 square mile circle. The airways, the north airway is to the top of the circle and the south airway is to the bottom of the circle. We also made an amazing discovery when I traveled to New York to go to the National Archives there. I found 3,000 pages of court transcripts from wrongful death suits that were consolidated. This was the first consolidated court case where 4 families, I learned, didn't accept the settlement offered by Northwest. Just like they do today, they did in the past. Quickly, the airline contacted all the families and said, here's $10,000. Never mention this again. We're paying you off. It was in the neighborhood of that much, which is a lot, but 4 families didn't choose that. So for me to be able to read these transcripts, now, of course, I was looking for some hidden bit of information that was expressed during the court case that might help us narrow down the search area. And there were Coast Guardsmen, there were people that worked for Northwest that were interviewed. But interestingly, the last radio operator who communicated with the flight was not interviewed in court. I later learned that he was sent to Alaska so the Korean War had started and he was based in Alaska. Suffice it to say, I think maybe he was sent to Alaska so that he couldn't testify. But of those 3,000 pages, there was really no clues. And let me tell you, reading transcripts is nothing like watching court on TV. Very little, the attorneys allowed these witnesses very little leeway to say anything. So as I was turning the page, hoping that a Coast Guardsman might say, you know, we were searching right here to look for, no, cut off, no, can't talk about that. So what I did learn from the pages of these transcripts were the human stories, 4 amazing human stories. One about a wife who was, the lawyers dug deep into her background to find out that she had had a child out of wedlock and she'd lost her husband on this flight. And they were grilling her about her out of wedlock child instead of worrying about the fact that she lost her husband and had no one to support her. So it was some amazing reading. Well, after all that research, yes, sir. No, yeah. Oh, Mike. Or you could talk loud. Do we know if it broke apart in flight? No, that's actually kind of a mystery whether it broke apart in flight. We believe that it did hit the water because of because we talked to some aviation experts and the human remains, and we believe that it was a crash into the water. It could have been a lightning strike. So we don't know.
Did I hear you say that the side scan radar needed to be 30 feet above the surface?
30 feet above the lake bottom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, otherwise that would be,
It'd be flying, yeah.
Sorry, I've been doing this for so long, I take a lot of things for granted. We've got another question.
Yeah, maybe you're going to speak to this, but I quickly looked at some of the copy that from Craig Rich in the paper, and he said that some people were hearing some loud noises or sound as it was going over the land, I assume.
Yes, and I don't talk about all the things as a 380 some page book, so there's a lot of detail in here. But yes, we did interview a lot of seniors who were alive and remembered something. And so we were able to track through interviewing people that all the way from Glenn down to Benton Harbor, there were people that heard the plane, There were some people that saw a flash in the sky. There was one man, Commander Helm, who believes he saw the plane offshore turning around. And so we were getting a lot of good intel. And our team, I don't usually talk about this, although I do mention in the book, our team kept talking to Clive Cussler about looking south because we believe that the pilot changed airways to avoid the storm. We thought he was trying to kind of run around the south end of this squall line. And Cussler writes the check, so he gets to pick the search area. And so when he sent his team back, he was often deciding where the search would take place. And so part of that decision was to expand in the area 18 miles northwest of Benton Harbor. And so he did come back that next year, and we started talking about this at our Knickerbocker show right over there in the theater. And in that theater, you know, we had events talking about it. And so the media started covering our team. Now that author there is not me, because at this point I had just written the one article. That's Clive Cussler that they're talking about. But we did get a lot of media attention that filled the auditorium at the Nick in 2005. And I was standing at the podium there. I think that's a picture of me at the Nick. And I was talking about this accident, and I remember having kind of a moment where I was doing the math, and I didn't do such good math before, but it was 2005, and I was going, hey, this just happened 55 years ago. And I did the math, and I said to the audience, I was kind of babbling. I said, well, you know, I suppose there could be people alive today that knew some of the victims. And it was kind of crazy because it was literally the next week that an email came in from a Kenneth Skog. Kenneth Skog was one of the victims. And I thought, did this accident really happen? Did he live? And so I quickly replied to that email. And what I learned was that Kenneth Skog, the man in the photograph, is the man who died. And I learned that this family from the Detroit area, Ken Skog, the second, the third, and the fourth, they're all named Ken Skog in memory of the paternal man who died. And with that, this became so much more than a hunt for remains on the bottom of this lake. This became a hunt for closure for these families. And talking to them was so emotional to have, after 55 years, to have them tearing up and crying about this and wondering why the government didn't spend longer than a week looking for the remains. And then it was just a couple weeks later that I get another email, the power of the media, you know, to reach out. I get an email, I laugh at his email to this day, Uncle Scrooge. I guess he's, you know, that's his handle, but it's from William Kaufman. And at that point, I had had such an emotional time meeting with the Skog family that I didn't really want to reply. I didn't have any good news. I couldn't tell them that we'd found the wreck, but I did invite Bill Kaufman here, and I later met with his sister. But this is Bill Kaufman, his mother, Jean, who died in this plane crash when Bill was just 6 years old. And so Bill told me the story of how the media came to his father's house and posed them in this picture. And the caption says, the children don't know what's going on, and the father is reading to them. And there's Bill in the upper right-hand corner. And he told me that when this photograph was taken, they knew that their mother had been lost in this plane crash, and yet the media was posing them. And he just remembered how horrific that was in their grief, that the media was interested in a scoop, and the media is no different today. But he also shared with me that being 6 years old at the time, they did have a memorial service for his mother, but the father said, you can't come to this. This is just for adults. And so he felt that he had really missed out being able to honor his mother. And when our team heard that, we arranged to take Bill and his sister Brandy and the Skogs out on a boat. Chuck and Sally Cooper from Holland offered their 35 or 40-foot boat to do this. And a pastor from our church, Trinity Church on the south side at the time, the pastor offered to come out there and do a service. And we put out a wreath and we read all the names and there was a bell ringing. And after Bill Kaufman said to me, do you guys do this for every ship that you're looking for? And we, no. Those are all century-old shipwrecks. We did this because we felt that by being out there, by searching, by sharing with the media, that we were sort of invading these people's lives and privacy. So we felt we had to give back. And Bill Kaufman had such a tough time growing up. His younger brother ended up committing suicide. They had a real struggle growing up with the dad. That Bill challenged me to find other families. He wanted to meet other people and learn how they had survived the tragedy. And so I had names from these newspapers, and some of them were very unusual names, and some of them, like last name George, were very difficult. But one by one, I found so many of these individuals. I found Vern Wolf's wife. Vern Wolf was the co-pilot. I met with his wife and his sister. His sister was 101 years old when I traveled to Minneapolis to interview them. Robert Lind, I connected with his nieces and nephews, learned quite a story about his family. Bonnie Ann Feldman, the stewardess, I learned she had taken ill and was on this flight because she had traded shifts to get home earlier. Benjamin and Slava Houston, he had been just diagnosed with prostate cancer. And so when you think about it, you know, this was kind of a quick way to go rather than a long way to go. Carl and Louise Schlachter, I learned they were so in love, they used to sign their name Carl Lou as if they were one. The Freng family, they were the most well-to-do people. He was a vice president of ITT. They were traveling with their youngest daughter. Their oldest daughter was married and pregnant. She stayed behind. She would lose her entire family in this accident. And Leo Waller. Leo Waller had 7 children. He was a hairstylist. He was in New York getting some classwork to improve his business. We're going to talk about Leo Waller a little bit later. And Rosalie Gorski, and I learned that she was pregnant, but her husband never knew. It was her sister that told me. So the husband didn't know that he had lost a wife and a child. And this is Frank Schwartz. He was supposed to be giving away his daughter at her wedding the next day. And of course, that was a tragic event for her. And I learned about the Hokinson family, John Kay and little Janice and Tommy. They were the only complete family on the plane. I met with relatives of theirs who shared home movie footage. These are real people. I got to know each and every one of these family members. And we were still only in maybe our 3rd year of the search. And at that point, I realized as I spoke to all these people and they shared their grief and we cried together on the phone, I realized I had to write a book. But I'd never written a book before. I'd just written in that one article. So I didn't quite feel that I was up to a narrative nonfiction novel. But I was glad that Clive Cussler continued to back the searches. I don't much talk about it in the book, but we figure to pay his crew and housing and food, we figure he was spending about $50,000 every spring for a month-long search effort. And so Mr. Cussler paid quite a bit of money. And each year we extended the coverage, working outward, trying to cover all areas of the circle. We kept trying to get them to go south. They kept kind of wanting to go north. Finally, we could kind of get them down there. We covered a big area. We covered about 400 square miles and did not find any trace of the airliner, but we found a lot of shipwrecks. A lot of shipwrecks. And each time we would find a shipwreck in the spring, we would spend the summer documenting it. And then do a program at the Knickerbocker about it. One of our early discoveries was the Hennepin. Turns out this was the world's first self-unloader, very significant ship. I wrote a National Register nomination, and it's now the only shipwreck in the Michigan waters of Lake Michigan on the National Register. And at that point, I teamed up with another historian, and we wrote a book. So this was one of my early books. I didn't talk about my first children's book, but I'm sort of cutting my teeth with these new discoveries, and I'm learning. And this book won an award, so I guess maybe I had some ability to write. Another discovery we made was a half of a ship impaled in the bottom. This was pretty crazy. It was the car ferry Ann Arbor #5, lost on its way to the Padno scrapyard. We actually think the contractor kind of let it go down. Didn't really accidentally go down. But so we were having some discoveries. Then Clive Cussler, who normally didn't come to Holland, he just wrote the check and his team of experts would do the searching. Well, he came to Holland. So this is me with Clive Cussler in my kitchen. And so it's been kind of fun to have Clive Cussler there. A lot of people ask, what's he like? What's the inside story? He was a very genuine, very humble man. I kept trying to get new stories out of him. And I realized every time he told us a story about one of his searches, I'd read about it in the book. So there was really nothing new he could share, but what a wonderful man. So he did spend a couple days out searching. So I want to just share, we didn't always go out. Often we had a member on board, but this day the boat's small. Ralph had started bringing his own boat instead of using our boat. So the 3 sonar operators were on the boat with Clive. I'll just tell you, we cut the video here. Clive had just had knee surgery a couple weeks earlier. So what a trooper he was.
When you first, saw things on the screen, what were you thinking? Look.
They made a couple discoveries.
That was wrong with shipwrecks. Found the one that I guess is possibly a schooner or something. Then as we came down, we found another what we thought was a section of it, just way out on the edge of the wreck. No, they were very much out of mile.
So just,
Clive, is this the first time you've been out searching in Lake Michigan?
Second.
is it the first time? Clive said, no, the second time. Out there 2 days, and they made
Fair to say the North
2 discoveries.
Pretty calm today, it was like a beer.
He said calm, like a mirror out there. Well, it's usually not calm. But the discoveries that were made when Clive was out there is this one wreck. It turned out to be called the Joseph Farnan, a ship that burned and sank in 1889, and another ship called the William Tell that you see here. And each of these discoveries, we did the research, we identified the ships, we wrote about them, very exciting. This is the Hattie Wells. So you're getting a sense for what side scan looks like here. And there's an artist rendering of the Hattie Wells, lost in 1885. And then this very interesting ship that burned due to having lime on board. And when lime gets wet, there's a chemical action. I worked with one of the professors at Hope who tested the cargo, and that was how we were able to confirm the identity of the ship. So we were making all kinds of discoveries, and none of them were the airplane, but that prompted me to write this particular book about many of our different discoveries. So I was really kind of honing my craft at that point. And then we did make a discovery, this one on land, not in water. We reached out to several of the cemeteries wondering what happened to the human remains that were brought ashore. And in the Riverview Cemetery in St. Joseph, the sexton was able to find under the ends, they found a reference to unknown parts of body from airliner wreck in Michigan. And we learned that they had been buried in a grave that was never marked. And we set out to find a way to mark that grave. How do you mark a grave if you don't own the grave? So I'm going to play a newscast. I hope you can hear the words here. We're going to turn up the sound.
started searching for the remains of the plane about
Just
5.
high as it can go.
We have yet to find the remains of the airplane, but we found something.
Can you do anything about the sound?
Searching through old records, they found evidence of unmarked grave.
And it was
I'm
about
gonna go
one
back
line.
again. I don't know why our sound is. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Here's
A
the news-
Michigan
yeah.
group started searching for the remains of the plane about 5 years ago.
And we have yet to find the remains of the airplane, but we found something more important, I think.
Searching through old records, they found evidence of an unmarked grave.
And it was about a one line that basically said that there was a plane crash victims from 1950 that were buried in Riverview Cemetery, which is where we're at today.
Even though most had their own services in towns across the country in 1950, Saturday was the first time victims had a memorial at their true resting place.
So it was really hard to come, but I thought, oh, I just, one day in my life that I really don't want to miss.
Victims' relatives wore pictures of their loved ones near their hearts, where the memories had never left.
I was 16 when it happened, and I can remember when my mother, who was his sister, told us what had happened. I thought, oh, maybe he didn't get on the plane.
Some human remains washed ashore back in 1950. The Coast Guard cremated them and buried them in this graveyard, but no family members were ever notified.
Don't know what remains are buried there, but just for that reason, I assume that my mother's are. And so for the first time, she's not, quote, lost.
There's not so much sadness as, 58 years has gone by. They talk about completion and tying up some ends. There are a lot of things that we still don't know about.
The group hopes to give the families that too. But for some, the answer to where helps closure finally start.
Just to have a picture in my mind of near where the plane crashed, and a beautiful spot where they're resting.
It was Jeff Philbrant from the Philbrant Funeral Home in South Haven who donated that stone with all 58 names. And there were 12 families that came from around the country to participate in that service, something that never happened, so many years ago. One of the individuals who came to that service was the daughter of Merle Barton, the hairstylist. And she brought me things that Northwest gave to her mother. She was just 2 years old when this happened. Merle Barton was a hairstylist. There's his name. There's his hairstylist kit. Destroyed, when it hit the water. Is this an amazing thing to have? His checkbook register survived. And you can still read the $99 one-way ticket in the checkbook register. These have all been in a museum exhibit, and this is his suit jacket. This is his suit jacket. This is unbelievable to have these things. This taught us so much about this accident, just to have these things. So really extraordinary. And that was the power of reaching out, not finding the plane, but reaching out and having the input of these families. While we continue to make new discoveries, you're starting to learn what seeing a side scan means. There's a whole ship down there, the Hamilton. This one, I think I've already shown this picture, the William Tell. And this was a ship that we have yet to be able to identify. It's a very, very old schooner based on its design. So we're hoping to identify that. And we made a very new discovery. This is a houseboat off of Saugatuck that we believe was dumped out there on purpose. So we are making so many different discoveries. This was interesting, a barge. Obviously, it wasn't the airplane each time we could tell that this was not parts of an airplane. This is just a commercial work barge that I was able to track down to some vandalism by kids when they were building the nuclear power plant at Palisades. They cut loose a work barge and we found it. So we're making all kinds of discoveries. We also started in the later years of this search. We've carried on past Clive Cussler's death in 2020, and we made some interesting discoveries. Now, what does that look like? You've seen a lot of side scans. That's an airplane, right? Well, it's not. We knew from the scale that this was not a commercial airliner, but there have been 4 small planes that have gone down in the waters off South Haven. So when we saw this side scan, we did the research on those 4 planes. We tracked down the families of those 4 planes. We had the phone number of the NTSB. We were ready to do the right thing when we found this. And then we got down, and it's 2 pieces of wood. It's a piece of a dock that floated far offshore. So side scan is not always perfect. Side scan was invented by Marty Wilcox, the man who invented baby ultrasound. So sometimes you need an expert to know if it's a boy or girl. And now this is off Glen. It's in about 250 feet of water. That is what an airplane crash site should look like, about the size of a football field. The magnetometer that we were carrying had some hits of metal, and we were sure this was it, so much so that Clive flew in to be there on the day that we sent divers down. And while I don't have a picture of what was down there, the diver came up and said, well, it looks to be a field of scrap metal. It was a load, I learned after scouring newspapers, a load coming from Padnos south on a barge. It got lost in a storm. The barge overturned. It dumped out all the scrap metal in the shape of a splattered airplane. And we found it. I've been in touch with the Padnoses to say, do you want your scrap metal back? Because of course it would cost, it's valuable scrap metal, but it would cost twice as much as its value to bring it up from 250 feet. And then our team made an amazing discovery. Gosh, does that look like debris from an airplane, just 75 years underwater. And when we got down there, it's dredging debris from the St. Joe Channel that was dumped 10 miles offshore. Last year, we made this discovery north of St. Joe, splattered airplane. It's gotta be splattered airplane. No, it's a field of clay, just geological formations down there. So we've had 4, and I'll tell you about a 5th discovery that all should have been the airplane, but they weren't. Well, all this media attention got us a call from the team that puts together Expedition Unknown. Has anybody watched Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates? Well, Josh Gates, I did one other episode with him, and then we did an episode here. Well, let's hope there's something on there. We made a discovery.
We retrieved the AUV, load the data onto a laptop, and start combing through the results of the day's sonar scan. So this looks a lot like what we were seeing in the boat the other day. This featureless spot, right?
I really think we're looking for a scattered debris field, maybe a couple of hard hits for the engine.
Right. Miles of lake bottom scroll by, and all we see is nothing. But then,
that looks like that could be debris.
here,
Yeah. Can you zoom in on that, Randy?
yes. That looks like debris.
Oh my goodness. Look at this. Oh my goodness. Oh.
That's debris. I mean, that looks like the engine and that could be body, right? Yeah. Oh my word. This is what it means to look for something for 15 years. Valerie is overwhelmed at the possibility of finally locating the plane. Could be it. We're close, yet so far. How deep down is that target? Like 270. Can your dive guys get down to 270? Yeah. Diving to those depths requires special training and special equipment, which means I'm not the one who's going to be able to fetch whatever's down there. Valerie has a team, though, that can reach the bottom. Let's call them.
Yeah, let's get down there and see what this is. The film crew didn't understand why I wasn't jumping for joy. And, you know, that seemed like it really could be real, that this sonar image, you can kind of pick out an engine cowling, you know, the DC-4 had 4 engines and debris, and it's about the right size. And our team did get down there, and I have just one image. Yeah, it was a field of debris from an airplane. Our diver brought up a clamp. And well, we've got a pilot, at least one pilot in the room, who knows that anything aviation has a safety wire on it, and anything aviation has serial numbers carved in it. And when we got back to shore, we were able to check the serial number to track whether it was from this DC-4, and that serial number tracked to a 747 that was operated by Kalitta Air. And in 2004, an engine fell off that plane. And what we had found was not the engine. The engine was salvaged. We found the remains that were holding that engine onto the plane. So we actually found a piece of a plane, and yet it still wasn't our plane. So, you know, a lot of people have questioned, you know, are you sure that you did full coverage? And the sonar that we use, the side scan sonar, can create a mosaic image. So you're seeing the lights and darks are all the lanes that we run. It's put together as a mosaic image, so you can see if you missed an area. So we know we haven't missed anything. And then, of course, some people have said, you know, well, maybe you didn't go far enough. Maybe it's farther south or west or north. And we don't believe that it could be any farther because we have worked with scientists. They know where the debris was found. They know when the plane disappeared. There was a period of 48 hours. And we know that the lake can't move debris quickly. Did you have a question? Proves it was a UFO. That's what I'm here to say, you know, aliens. So beware. We've also, scientists have, in the 20 some years we've been doing this, scientists have new systems. They've run new hindcasting studies for us. The scientists have really narrowed down the crash area to right here. We fully covered that area. We do believe that the pilot changed airways to try to fly south of the storm. And those same scientists that work on studying drift and water also study lake currents. And like one shipwreck that we found, this side scan was barely visible. And when we got down there, this ship is buried to the deck with sediment. And there's another ship that we have seen on some occasions, and we come back on other occasions and we can't see it. And so we know that in the south east portion of Lake Michigan, the prevailing winds and waves will turn over that bottom sediment. So we are convinced that in these 75 years, that the plane, the wreckage that would have been, you know, if it can do this to a soup coat, we're certain that these small pieces of the plane have become buried. Now, that's not to say that there won't someday be some major storm that would churn up the bottom and reveal it, but we can't go back every summer looking in the same place again. So it might take a new team in a different life
you know, to find this. So what I so badly wanted to do is have an X to mark the spot of this accident.
If the plane was at 3,500 feet, as his last known location, and if the pilot was going to crash, even in a dive, he would have had a few seconds to declare a mayday. So having not declared a mayday, would it not imply that it came apart and you have microbursts and all sorts of reasons why airplanes might come apart in the air? If it came apart, the debris would be much more scattered because you have winds aloft, it would carry light pieces further.
It would.
And those are easier to bury than a jet that went that, or DC-4 that hit the water at high speed. It would not scatter so far about that it would be.
Very true, very true. So it could, yeah, we've thought this through many times. If something explodes in the air, the debris really scatters. The engines would maybe go straight down. If it hits the water and if it's in 100 feet of water, it doesn't have a big cone to.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
flying pieces like the wings, the tail section, they will actually float for a while because they will, you know, the air will fly them away. So it would be harder to find. So at 3,500 feet, it's hard to believe that the guy would not declare a mayday. And I don't even know why he didn't declare a mayday to get down to 2,500 that he wanted. But one reason, if you're going northbound and east, but this was going northwest, but anyway, north, you fly at odd 1,000 plus 500 in VFR. East and west and south, you fly even 1,500. So if he knew there was traffic coming the other way at 2,500, he would have deviated out of the airway in order to be able to come down lower.
So what I learned from interviewing, you're spot on, interviewing senior pilots, interviewing the chief pilot of Northwest. He was 94 years old. He was actually on site looking at the debris. And after interviewing many pilots, we learned that what they do is they aviate, navigate, then communicate. So we think that this pilot was caught in the storm. He was doing the best he could. He probably changed airways. He probably went down. Better to take a chance at, you know, barely missing something than being caught up in a storm. And so we don't think there was time to radio an emergency. Perhaps if he did radio that emergency, maybe that's why the operator was sent to Alaska and didn't, you know, there could have been some hanky-panky. There were a lot of accidents back in the day. This was the worst. This was something that Northwest didn't need to, you know, publicize. And so there's a lot of strange things that can happen. But in all that research, and you know, we started in 2004, and the book came out about 2013. So in those 9 years, and then in subsequent editions, we really realized that the answers don't lay on the bottom of the lake. The answers lay in our research. So by doing the research, we learned about the plane, the actual DC-4, where it was made. Just hold on just a minute. We learned that there was a chain of communication that was just broken. There were a number of different problems. The airline didn't communicate that the storm had changed direction. That plane that was leaving Milwaukee that actually never took off due to the bad storm on the lake. So a lot of these problems combined to cause issues for this. This was the chart that the pilot was given to talk about an east moving squall line. What we learned is that before this accident took place at about 10 o'clock that evening, he was in the vicinity of the lake at midnight. So at 10 o'clock, the National Weather Service chart came out. It showed that the east moving squall had changed direction, was moving south. So if that pilot, in fact, chose to leave his primary flight corridor to go on the southern flight, that storm would have still hit him. And we learned from Joseph Kim, the chief pilot, as I told you, that's him at 94 when we interviewed him. We learned that the flyers back in the day didn't understand microbursts, didn't understand downdrafts. If our pilot chose to go down to 2,500 to fly under the storm, he didn't have, he couldn't fly over at the time. There was no air, what's the, yeah. So he couldn't fly over the storm. So to fly under, if he chose to go down to 2,500, our lake is at 600, so he's only 1,900 feet above the surface of the lake. A downdraft or a microburst could have just hit him into the water. A lightning strike could have ignited the fuel vapors in the wings. They were almost depleted by the time he got to Lake Michigan area. So Joe Kim gave us a number of different theories, and a painter that we involved painted an idea of what might have happened over the lake, and we've put together a little reenactment. There's some sound here, but we don't really need the sound to just put us on the plane that night, thinking about what those people faced. Pitch black, midnight, looking out their windows, not seeing anything. The pilot doing what he can to aviate, to navigate, maybe not understanding the altimeter, lightning. He would have been caught right in the middle of that storm. That's very difficult. The passengers would have not known what was taking place. And the pilot doing the best that he can to try to fly out of that storm. But he didn't understand what direction, and then potentially the plane hitting the water and it being a quick ending for everybody. There was nobody that suffered in this other than during the height of the storm. So what we realized in doing all that research, we know what happened. We don't know exactly where it happened, but what's important is that after all these years, we've been able to tell the story of all these individuals. And there are quite a few details in the book, where people were when they heard the news, how people honored these individuals' lives. None of this would have been possible had we found the wreck in the first or second or even third year of our search. We would have found it, we would have announced to the media, it would have gone viral for a couple of days, and then we would have moved on. So we really think something Clive said to me, I think is really true. He said, these wrecks will only be found when they want to be found. And I don't think Flight 2501 wanted to be found. I think it wanted us to offer closure to these people. So after I'd had a number of books under my belt, I was finally able to write this book, and it doesn't have the little award sticker, but it did win an award. And thank you, Anne, for taking care of all my mistakes along the way. But this is really the solution to what happened. And so I hope that today's program shared a little of the details. You hear me ramble about it. The book is much more concise than I delivered today. But thank you very much. And we'll do some questions.
Can we assume that this accident predated the common use of the black box?
No black boxes. That came about 10 years later. But interestingly, Bill Kaufman, I've gotten to know him. I just talked to him at the anniversary this year. And I remember one thing that Bill said to me is he said his mother was coming back from a trip to Europe, and they'd had a phone call before, and she had bought some little Swiss bell, like a cowbell. And he said, if you get down there and you find the cowbell, could you return it to me? And, you see, we found everything but the cowbell. So, it still haunts these people. And, I, of course, felt bad to get everybody's hopes up, but I think the book did its job by keeping the memory of this accident and these people alive. And even as silly as, reality television is, I must say I've done a lot of reality TV, but Expedition Unknown, this particular episode, they did a really credible job I didn't let them say anything that was nonsense like UFOs. And so, you know, we've reached a national audience that way. So it's really been important when you think of what's been done for all the planes that crashed at 9/11 and the memorials and, memory documentaries every year at the anniversary. This never happened for this accident, but our involvement in searching has kind of put it into the forefront. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
About a year ago, I was flying out of Dallas and we're about a minute into the flight and all of a sudden we heard this huge kaboom and it startled all of us. And about 15, 20 seconds later, the pilot came on and said, we've been hit by lightning. And so we're going to turn around. And so we were given immediate clearance to land ASAP. And he dropped that puppy in no time. I found out later that there is a shield that is put on aircraft. So as if you are hit by lightning, it directs it right back to the source. And that's why there may be many flights that are hit by lightning, but you don't experience it, let alone hear it.
They didn't have that in 19.
That's what I'm assuming. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So lightning could have been an incident. Yeah.
Virtually all airplanes made out of metal have the Faraday cage protection. So lightning does not impact almost ever the airplane per se. Electronics in the airplane, if they're shorted, things like that, sometimes are affected. But newer, more modern airplanes that are made out of composites, then they do put a coating on in order to create the Faraday cage. This would have not been the case in 1950. Those airplanes were made out of metal. They would have had Faraday cage protection.
Yep. Yep. And what the pilots that I've worked with a lot of pilots on this very closely because I'm not a pilot, obviously, but the fuel, when it dissipates from the wings, it creates a space that has just gas.
Yeah, the top of the fuel tank can have fuel vapor that's highly flammable. And yeah, that could always be a problem, but the more likely scenario in situation like this is spatial disorientation, microburst, things of this sort. But this is the first time I've even heard of this flight.
Yeah.
But yeah, as a pilot, I know that that's more the case.
Yeah, yeah. I interviewed one woman who was a 13 at the time, and she lived south of Glen, and she remembers an explosion in the air, a bright light, and Commander Helm, who was, we never met him, but we read in the newspaper, he was down by Benton Harbor, and he saw an explosion as well, and he was a military guy. He probably knew what he was talking about. When you triangulate these two sightings, it does fall within visual area of the hotspot that we think that this accident happened. And that hotspot coincides with the scientists' probability area now, 20 years in hindsight doing this. So as I said, I think we know where it happened. I think we know basically why it happened. We don't know if it exploded or hit the water, but what we do know is Northwest Airlines didn't communicate the changing direction of that storm. And so the pilot didn't have full information to make a decision. We did an interview a pilot flying that night who, when he saw the storm, he decided to turn around and land at Lansing. And the reason I call this fatal crossing is our particular pilot, Robert Lynn, chose to cross the lake when other pilots, chose not to, the pilot in Milwaukee that didn't take off. So yeah, there's still a few little mysteries here, but for the most part, we've solved this accident. We just don't know exactly what happened. So, anything else? Well, thank you. Appreciate it. If anybody wants to see these artifacts up close, I have them here. Oh. Okay.